Uh, Hi everyone, welcome to my paper, Cosmic Afterlives, Black Disabled Psychogeographies through Marvel's Looking Glass. It was presented as part of the Marxism and Disability Network's 2025 seminar series as well. For those of you watching this from overseas, I talk about Guy DeBord's psychogeography through a take on rural Northamptonshire, which is a county within the East Midlands. Cosmic thinks about psychogeography through a metaphor of the Marvel Infinity Stones, the Soul Stone, one of the 6 fictional entities that controls vital aspects of the universe: reality, time, space, soul, power, mind. The Soul Stone allows users to control, alter, steal, manipulate, living and dead souls, a metaphor for thinking about spaces and places, and how they affect my emotions in rural Britain, namely Northamptonshire. It got me to think about the spirits of slave owners in country houses as hostile to black visitors like me, as much as these spirits are attractive to white visitors and staff. In that way, their wide rooms, grounds, and tall ceilings allow specifically white women to escape into the sunshine slavery and colonial afterlife of Jane Austen, as Rafia Zakaria writes in her book Against White Feminism. At a time when white women were still the legal property of their husbands, the opportunity to taste ancestral power was too tantalizing to resist. Psychogeography is a term that comes from the Marxist tradition of the 1950s and was popularized by French Marxist Guy Debord to define how spaces and places impact the emotions. As in lots of work, it has been used to explore urban cities. As a black disabled person who's spent swathes of my life in small towns and the countryside, this is something I thought about in the UK conversation about black access to the countryside. Concurrently, psychogeography is something I began to think of alongside the cosmic elements of the Marvel universe as a way to visualize what scholar Elizabeth Freeman talks about as a shock to the common sense that may release enough energy to blow out a few institutional fuses. Disabled and black. My access to the rural countryside arrives with being seen within the logic of enslavement, since in rural Britain, how black people are seen is in view of labour, revisiting the plantation. Effectively, these spaces are just greenwashing greenwashing colonialism. Continued black experiences of the rural country estates do not position us as belonging in it, although the black presence in rural Britain goes back many centuries. How black people experience these places meets the remit of whiteness, mirrored across society that psychologist Ghislaine Kunani wrote about as the ways the structure of white supremacy becomes embedded, normalized, and inscribed within modes of feeling, thinking, being in, and on the world to maintain the illusion of white superiority. Her description of whiteness as the everyday performance of white supremacy is something I came to see imbued in country estates. We go to these places that were built on, many of them built on black labour, and that spirit of white supremacy is laced or etched into the buildings. I go to these places and feel off-centered. A feeling hangs in the air, pushing me away, something along the lines of leave now, death here. Country houses as products of chattel enslavement, at least some of them, I came to see as monuments to black genocide, and the ghosts that remain there are both of victims and perpetrators. Since the George Floyd protests of 2020, we have seen lots of discussions of why black people should be in these spaces, but very little of why we should want to. There are unseen dangers for us in empire institutions. In the words of Wong, while the Avengers fight physical dangers, we sorcerers fight more mystical threats. I came to think about buildings as living objects able to spellcast microaggressions. I thought about whiteness as enchantment. The buildings of historic spaces like country houses and many universities absorb that power in one time, like a virus, mutating, splitting, growing, reproducing, adapting, multiplying, and then later on radiating that energy in what we call the present. Mainly for my own benefit, I referred to this experience as anthropomorphic whiteness to describe how historic objects like buildings may take on human traits, like, like the human-made performance of white supremacy, so racism as spiritual warfare. They enchant white visitors, empowering them to do terror against black staff. The levels of policing colleagues have experienced is monumental. The country house empowers white women in the same way the pub empowers the white man. We must also think about how if black people need to be included in everything white people have, and if representation politics has overlooked what racism does to the spirit. In my culture, the Caribbean island of Jamaica and Grenada, we call these spirit Duppy, which Bob Marley actually wrote a song about called Duppy Conqueror for his 1973 album Burning, thinking about the Marvel universe and how certain spaces carry an energy. I come back to that idea of how spirit, in a context of spiritual racism that occupies houses via that historical manifestation of empire. Guy DeBord's psychogeography is a sort of a tool or a vehicle for what we can develop on out of its urban city origins into debates of the rural, haunting, ghosts, and how buildings themselves become the ghosts. Since heritage is dominated by this, since heritage is very white and very middle class, most of the women encountered are also white. I read one report by Historic England that described the workforce as 90% white and 66% women, which may speak to the ways in which white female privilege runs through heritage organisations and these estates. Here, at least in my experience, blackness is rendered disabled through white supremacy as a disabling process. Like in Jane Austen's work, these properties are places in which white women can escape, upheld by processes of black labour, slavery. So black people at these sites are seen as visitors or even labourers in the place of the slave. So is blackness the only alter of difference made disabled by capitalism? No, but that does not mean there is ever a capitalism that is not protected by or sustained by white womanhood. Such instances in the states, like Central Park Karen and Permit Patty, revisit how, at the micro level, white women, as the right hand to white men, will sort and stack people into groups, even their own, in order to get one up and get more. My experience at country houses revisits that dynamic where blackness is rendered disabled under white terrorism upon the body. As a historian and a sociologist, one of my most useful methods for finding stuff out is walking. And for my work on texts like Bridgerton and Jane Austen, walking these grounds stimulates the sense. Walking around Delapree Abbey, an English independent heritage site in Northampton, England, I'm haunted by the unquiet memories. Something went on here, and as I'm walking, one is often stared at like I don't belong. And even in conversation, I've been asked what I'm doing here, what I'm doing there. There is an empowerment that white women have in these spaces, where they might draw on the power from the aesthetic in the same way white men are empowered at the pub or the police station and so forth, as places that ultimately protect patriarchy. Calvin Boy Powell and Holly Henderson's analysis of the UK higher education gender equality framework and Athena Swan shows how equality and diversity and inclusion initiatives, EDI, benefits middle-class white women more than any other group. In the US, sociologist Jessie Daniels writes in her recent book, Nice White Ladies, How Affirmative Action has moved white women into a structural power or a structural position in which they share more in common with white men than they do with Black or Latina women. White women's staff render Black people both invisible and hypervisible. These spaces in the 19th century privileged them both as slave owners and the relatives of slave owners, shown in the slave trade compensation records, where 40% of claims were made by women. In the colonial afterlife of Jane Austen, then, we black folks walk these spaces to be met with sunshine slavery and the eternal shrills of white escapism. The colonial blood splatter is on the walls, where the constants of "why are you here's" dysregulates my nervous system. The fields, the lakes, and the gardens are like prisons, plantation, permanence. In 1987, Toni Morrison coined the term rememory. He discussed the act of recalling repressed memories that can be obscured or haunted, and even be the recalling the memories of ancestors long deceased and what they experienced. She coined it in US context of enslavement. Navigating the English rural, then, I'm brought back to how I'm haunted by what my ancestors experienced. Sociologist Avery Gordon describes haunting as a state in which abusive systems of power reveal themselves and their impacts felt in our daily lives. I use the term haunting to describe those singular yet repetitive instances when home becomes unfamiliar, when your bearings on the world lose direction, when the over and done with comes alive, when what's been in your blind spot comes into view. Haunting raises spectres, and it alters the experience of being in time, the way we separate the past, the present, and the future. Navigating Denneprey Abbey, I'm haunted by what my ancestors experienced. It takes me to what I experience as one of the most haunting lines in all of English literary fiction. In the opening lines of Rebecca, Daphne du Maurier writes, "Last night I dreamt I went to Mandalay again." Through Mandalay, I read Denneprey just as much as I read Buckingham Palace. Denneprey Abbey is a metaphor for the boomerang of economic violence where enslaved labour produced money that went into the country estates here in Britain that are still used today. The coloniser's ghost haunts Britain, where these sites may well be mass graves. So what I called anthropomorphic whiteness tells how on those estates one comes to be hit with the blood splatter of the ghost of empire. Sarah Ahmed writes, "The past is living rather than dead. It lives in the very wounds that remain open in the present." So that takes a double turn where my family history is of both enslaver and enslave. My maternal great-grandparents, Tory and Edson Noel, arrived in Northampton from Grenada in the early 60s in hope of a better life, part of the described Windrush migration. As the descendants of enslaved people, they were recolonized out of countryside, self-sufficient food pathways in Grenada by British immigration policy when they left that life in 1960 for the UK, where the gaps in labour left by the war had many Caribbean people leaving those rural farms for factory works in Britain, nursing and rail. From enslavement to farming communities, my ancestors were people intimately tied to the land, connected to it, moved by it, buried on it. But where's home? Northampton or Grenada? Coming to Northampton, they would not have seen Denneprey in the way I see it, as a keeper of secrets. But I do know that Grandma Toyley, like many Caribbean women of her generation from the countryside, knew about ghosts in the village. When black visitors go to country houses, are they haunted by their ancestors' ghosts or haunted by their ancestors' murderers? Growing up, I harboured these feelings. The slave compensation records and the database answers questions where family history is colonial history. In walking Denneprey, I am walking the rural Caribbean. In the words of poet Portia O, which side of the whooping whip has your family's blood on it? What's your name? What your name comes attached to? Volunteers at Denneprey. are now finding there might be colonial links to how parts of the building were built like the stables, but to corroborate that, we would need to visit the New York archives in the US. As the closer you are to the source, the less you see. Britain may have abolished the slave trade, but who ever heard of a spirit who actually died? Buildings as living entities may come to spellcast the worst behaviors of their occupants, even historically. This feeling, I think, is best shown in the 2017 episode of Doctor Who, Knock Knock, when Bill Potts and her friends rent a house, and the Doctor then notices there's something weird going on when the floors and the walls creak and monsters start crawling out of the wood. Very, very science fiction, but you get what I mean. Um, Walking the ground of Delapre, I'm also walking the fruits of my ancestors' labour, metaphorically. A Black British psychogeography almost lays a ground root for thinking about Black relationships not only to Black community spaces, but also what white spaces mean to us beyond the physical. Through walking, I've come to see racism not only as physical, but also as a spiritual project via buildings, statues, and also street names. For me, these tangible portals to a not so distant past harbour empire, manifesting the living dead. As part of the Infinity Stones hypothesis, the Soul Stone represents racism as spiritual warfare. How Black people may be in space and haunted by the feelings that live there is as much a Black psychogeography as it is a Black hauntology. Today's conversation of Black access to the countryside or country estates have not really asked this question. Just because we can diversify, does that mean we should? British colonial histories have focused on the real, the physical, the tangible, what you can touch, but not really thought to ask what monsters lurk in the dark. Thanks very much for listening. And as always, if you've got comments and questions and so forth, leave them in the comments or send me an email at treyventour.com/.